Well, last night was the first time foreign policy was discussed. Some of the leading voices within the GOP took to the stage to rally support for military intervention in Syria. Despite this, the main headlines are, of course, VP pick Paul Ryan's highly anticipated speech.
First, I think that the personal narrative part was the least effective part of the speech to me, because he did not feel very comfortable to me in the beginning of that speech giving it. As he got into it, when he got to places where it seemed like he felt more comfortable, which seemed to be more policy-oriented.
Tonight really belongs to Mitt Romney. What do we know about how he's preparing for tonight, Steve?
We do know that he has practiced. You remember a poll report that came out on Sunday when he was in Wolfsboro, New Hampshire, at the residence there, that he was practicing at a virtual replica, same teleprompter, same distance on the teleprompter, working on the speech. We are told by the campaign he's a bit of a tinkerer.
We hear there's a rumor that Clint Eastwood may show up.
Can you imagine Dirty Harry speaking at this forum? Steps from me, Carol Costello. I mean, what a night it will be. Here's what I can tell you. Here's what I can confirm. That the Romney camp is telling CNN, yes, there is this mystery guest, so there will be all these character witnesses, you know, folks who've worked with Romney at Staples and during the Salt Lake City Olympics, and also when he was, you know, running the state of the governor of Massachusetts. But we cannot definitively tell you that Clint Eastwood is showing up. Here's
all this hype when we have political figures pushing for the U.S. to get involved in another military conflict. Take Condoleezza Rice's remarks last night, and she wasn't alone. Senator John McCain also blamed the president for not doing enough in Syria and pushed for prompt military action.
Dictators in Iran and Syria butcher their people and threaten regional security.
When other courageous people fought for their freedom against sworn enemies of the United States, American presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, have acted to help them prevail.
And some headlines in print suggest military intervention is precisely what's going to happen. Here's a look at a few of them. Obama threatens to invade Syria. The Syria foreign minister, according to the Syria foreign minister, U.S. is a major player in the civil war. From the Washington Post, France urges action in Syria, and Turkey to open new Syria refugee camps for up to 120,000. So it looks like the ultimate plan is to intervene militarily. Here is State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland.
As the Secretary said, when we were in Istanbul, we have to first of all look at on the hastening the day side, the effectiveness of what we are already doing, the ground situation that we are seeing, which is changing and evolving, and what more could be done by allies and partners to support the Syrian opposition.
But how does the public feel about another military conflict? The polls say there isn't strong public support. Take a look at this poll. 63% of Americans favor multilateral economic sanctions. 58% support U.S. and its allies enforcing no-fly zones. 2/3 support the idea of enforcing safe havens inside Syria by the Arab League and Turkey. 48% favor sending weapons and other supplies to rebels. 47% oppose. Overall, little support for U.S. ground troop involvement. Well, to discuss U.S. foreign policy in Syria, I'm joined now by Cole Bockenfield, Director for Advocacy for the Project on Middle East Democracy. Cole, welcome.
Thank you.
So what do you think about those figures? Overall, it seems that Americans aren't overwhelmingly on board with the idea of direct intervention.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I think some of the comments that you see from Condi Rice and John McCain, it's interesting that those aren't reflective of the Romney campaign's position, that they're actually much further in front of him, and that his position is very consistent with the administration at this point. I don't think there's a lot of appetite for much more than we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and as we just saw, we saw McCain and Rice really pushing for military intervention. McCain really criticizing Obama for not doing enough over there. And you could see, it was interesting, you could see the attendees of the event at the RNC. They seem to be on board, seem to kind of be in support, but you do not see the kind of passionate support years ago at the prior conventions where people were so ramped up and hyped about going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq. What do you think the reasoning is behind that? Do people not really understand the conflict in Syria because it's more complicated or not as relevant. What do you think?
Well, I think of course the examples with Iraq and Afghanistan, it was a very different time in the wake of 9/11, and people had much more of an appetite to go after our enemies abroad. That the U.S. was very much under threat by these regimes. That's definitely not the case with Syria. It's a much more difficult case, and that's why even the proponents of intervention will much more likely point to humanitarian intervention rather than the existential threat of this regime to the U.S. or its allies in the region.
Right, so it seems this time around that foreign policy is kind of on the back burner.
Right.
It doesn't have as much passion, or there's not that much interest these days.
Oh, very much so. I think even among the neoconservative, the right community, there's a lot of criticism about the Romney campaign not speaking very much on foreign policy and national security issues, the way the Republican Party has done historically. And essentially, a lot of the positions so far have essentially boiled down to, well, we would do what the administration did, but we would do it sooner and tougher. But when you really try and deal out and tease out some specifics on that, they're a little bit light. And that's what I think a lot of the community would like to see more details on, to see some alternatives and what they would do.
Right, but what we are seeing is these top figures kind of taking this very hard line stance when it comes to Syria. And the U.S. often, and what we have been seeing, is taking this more non-interventionist approach in terms of doing things not as blatantly, but doing things from more behind the scenes. And based on that poll that we just saw, it appears that that's what Americans would favor. Yet that seems to be really at odds with what is being pushed by some of these figures within the GOP. Why do you think there is this disconnect here?
Well, I think a lot of that sentiment is coming from the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, where the ideas of intervention based on human rights and democracy and so on are still very popular. And these are a lot of Bush administration officials that still very much believe in that school of thought. That school of thought is not one that's been primarily reflected in the campaign, though. And as you mentioned, I don't think it's something where there's much of the same environment, the same mood in U.S. public opinion of how we're going to approach these problems.
Do you think, you mentioned the Bush administration sentiment, do you think that the Romney campaign sentiment mimics that of the Bush administration in terms of their hardline stances on foreign policy?
Well, it's a little bit early to tell, just because they haven't really spoken in detail about a lot of this. I mean, what you can see is that a lot of the campaign's advisors, their foreign policy advisors, are made up of a lot of former Bush administration officials. So it is, you can draw those lines, but like I said, I think on both sides of the debate, people want more details to sort of see where they come down on these debates.
Right. We are seeing this rhetoric. Do you think it is a sign that military intervention in Syria at this point is inevitable?
I don't think so. I think there's a lot of rhetoric. I think both the French president and President Obama have recently sort of staked out red lines that I think were implied, especially with the use of chemical weapons. As Obama said, he said, well, that would change my calculus on military intervention. But that signals a move toward intervention, I don't think so. I don't think we're close to there. I think right now the strategy is much more undermining Assad's support internally from different directions.
Right. We are based on this rhetoric. It seems like there is this push to portray it as black and white, the Syrian. The conflict in Syria as black and white, kind of good versus evil, almost this simplification of what is going on there. Do you think that it could be a disservice by characterizing it like that, when in fact what's going on there is quite complicated?
Well, it's definitely very complicated. I think that's really what's hindered the administration, I'd say, from making more decisive action. A lot of what they've been doing is spending a lot of time really trying to get to know the opposition. The differences between the internal opposition versus the external opposition, the influence of outside actors, where different communities fall on the spectrum. And until they can sort of get a better map, a better sort of spectrum of this, I think that will hold back really a lot of action here.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to play a clip from you from newly elected Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. Let's first take a listen to that.
Our solidarity with the struggle of the Syrian people against an oppressive regime that has lost its legitimacy is an ethical duty and a political and strategic necessity. We all have to announce our full solidarity with the struggle of those seeking freedom and justice in Syria. We must translate this sympathy into a clear political vision that supports a peaceful transition to a democratic system of rule. This will reflect the demands of the Syrian people for freedom.
Okay, so we have very strong words there from this from Morsi. What do you think he meant by that? What exactly did he mean by that kind of support?
Well, I think Morsi, of course, just until recently, until he came into power, he was on the side of the freedom fighters, the dissenters, and so on. So I think he's sending a message to the Syrian people that we're with you. And this is a very big shift, I think, for Egypt. And particularly having this message delivered in Iran, it will have a big impact.
All right. Cole, thank you so much for coming coming into the studio. I really appreciate it. That was Cole Bockenfield, Director of Advocacy for the Project on Middle East Democracy.